All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Ashley Green, Assistant Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. And it's my absolute privilege today to introduce our speaker at today's book launch, Dr. James Waller. Dr. Waller is the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. He also serves as the Director of Academic Programs for the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. He's the author of two editions of an award-winning book, Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing, as well as his more recent book, Confronting Evil: Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide. In 2017, Dr. Waller was the inaugural recipient of the Engaged Scholarship Prize from the International Association of Genocide Scholars in recognition of his exemplary engagement in advancing genocide awareness and prevention. And it's an absolute pleasure to be introducing him here today to speak about his latest book, A Troubled Sleep: Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland. Dr. Waller, thank you so much, and I'm going to turn this over to you. We're excited to hear about this new book.
Thank you, Ashley, very much for the kind introduction. Thank you all who have showed up for attending. I think with all the Zoom fatigue we have and the ways that many of us hope Zoom moves out of our life at some point soon, it has opened up possibilities like this to bring friends together from near and far to an event like this that would be hard to do if we were simply doing it in person. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us for this hour. And again, thank you to Ashley and the college for so kindly hosting this event. I'm going to share my screen with you now. What I'd like to do in the next 35 to 40 minutes is just lay out for you some of the basic arguments in the book, where the book came from, what the goal of the book was, and how the book relates to some of the events that we see today going on in Northern Ireland, even as we speak. This book, in terms of the path that led to it, I think with each of the books I've written, it's been interesting, at least for me, to look back and figure out how that book came to be. What was the path that led to that one? And the path to this book, A Troubled Sleep, actually started in 2016 with two events, one of which I knew was going to happen and the other of which I had no idea was going to happen. But the one I knew was going to happen was a publication of my most recent book, Confronting Evil: Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide. And in that book, I talked about all the different forms of prevention that we do before crisis starts, in the midst of crisis, and the type of prevention work we do when crisis is over. But a large part of what I spent my time on in the book had to do with that first stage of what we call upstream prevention. How do we build resilient societies so it makes them less likely to fall into the type of crisis we see in genocide, mass atrocity? And a large part of that work was focused on risk factors. What do we know quantitatively? What do we have the most evidence for about the types of things that leave a country susceptible to the risk of violent conflict or even to the risk of mass atrocity? So I looked, for instance, at things like contested memory, dysfunctional governance structures, social fragmentation, economic deterioration, all of these things that gave us a sense of what puts a country on the verge, what puts a country on the edge of the possibility for violent conflict. That same year, the unexpected piece that came was June 23rd, 2016, when Brexit, against most every prediction, was passed in the United Kingdom. I was teaching at the time a seminar in Venice, Italy, and I remember two specific things about that time in Venice. It was the hottest, most humid place I had ever been, and I grew up in the South, so that's saying something. But I also remember the time at the seminar when word started to get around that Brexit had passed, that the United Kingdom had actually voted very narrowly to leave the European Union. For me, I was anticipating a sabbatical the following year in 2017. Still hadn't really thought about what the sabbatical plans would be. But the moment I heard of Brexit, I knew immediately what the plans would be. And it would be, for me, a return to Northern Ireland. I had spent a good amount of time in Northern Ireland doing research, doing writing. I had taken 3 different student groups on month-long study visits to Northern Ireland over the course of my career. But once I came to Keene State, my directions had moved in terms of research and teaching in a little bit different direction. And it had been a while since I'd been to Northern Ireland, been a while since I'd stayed in touch with Northern Ireland, but I knew enough to know that Brexit, for all the impact it was going to have for England, for all the impact it would have for Scotland, for all the impact it was going to have for Wales, that it would have a seismic impact in Northern Ireland. And that's when I made the decision to spend my sabbatical and focus my next research project on risk and resilience in Northern Ireland. So the goal of the book, as I began working on it in 2017, was to offer comparative, evidence-based, nonpartisan analysis of risk and resilience in contemporary Northern Ireland. By comparative, I simply mean, how do we understand risk and resilience in Northern Ireland compared to what we've understood about risk and resilience in other fragile societies and other stable societies? What type of evidence-based understanding could we bring to it? And most importantly, in what nonpartisan way could I do that? So the research was done in 2017, much of it, during my sabbatical as an honorary visiting research professor at the Center George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. And I mentioned the Mitchell Institute for several reasons. One is Senator Mitchell was kind enough to write the foreword to A Troubled Sleep, and I was very deeply honored that he agreed to do so. But I also mention it because in addition to it being my home for several months during my time in Northern Ireland, we've also sent now 3 different Keene State students on for graduate work at the Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice. So we've developed some very strong institutional connections and student connections with Queens. During my time there, I spent more than 110 hours in face-to-face interviews with more than 60 politicians, activists, community workers, former political prisoners, current paramilitary members, journalists, police, religious, and community leaders. As many people were willing to talk to me, I was certainly willing to spend the time to speak with, to try to get an understanding on the ground of to what degree Northern Ireland was at risk, how much was the peace process a concern at this time, and what type of structures had Northern Ireland built in almost 20 years of peace that would have enabled it to withstand some of the stressors that I anticipated coming from Brexit and some other events as well. So in my time with you, I really just want to look at these 5 questions. What are the social identities at play in Northern Ireland? Recognizing that for most people in America, Northern Ireland is synonymous with Ireland, and they're relatively, fairly simplistic understandings of the identities at play. What is a risk posed by contested memory, dysfunctional governance, and social fragmentation? And I often, when I teach about Northern Ireland, say that the challenge of Northern Ireland is not just learning about Northern Ireland, but it's learning from Northern Ireland. And I think the second question is a from question. What can we learn in the US from Northern Ireland? Because we're also a country that lives with contested memory, that has lived with dysfunctional governance, and still lives with social fragmentation. Thirdly, what are the accelerants and triggers that could escalate the potential for widespread violence, which in the book I argued was significant. And unfortunately, this month, we've seen that type of violence erupt. So we'll talk a bit about why violence has erupted this month. And then finally, where's the space going forward? It's a contracted space, but where is the space for resilience and hope as we move forward? So I'll start first with the notion of the identities at play in Northern Ireland, the social identities in deeply divided society. Each of the chapters in the book, its main title is a quote from one of the interviews I've done. And one of the people I spoke with said, in Northern Ireland, you're one or the other. And I think that's very telling, especially the word other, because it says in Northern Ireland, it's less about interpersonal relationships in many cases, and it's more about intergroup relationships. And your one identity or the other identity. And the lack of a middle ground is one of the things that has been most concerning for us. So the us and them at play in Northern Ireland, very simply, but also very complexly, is this: that on the left-hand side, we see the divisions of Protestant. Very often, the divisions in Northern Ireland are spoken about as Protestant Catholic. That's the simplistic shorthand. On the Protestant side of the divide, in the most recent census in 2011, Protestants made up the majority of people in Northern Ireland between these two communities. People born Protestant are considered raised in a Protestant household, accounted for 48.36% of the population. The chances are very significant that's going to change in the 2021 census, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Aligned with Protestant is the political position of unionism. The unionist position refers to people who support Northern Ireland's constitutional status within the United Kingdom. So politically, they are in support of Northern Ireland as a territory that's united with, is within the United Kingdom. Typically, the unionist label is used for this political position. But then there's also a label called loyalist, which refers to paramilitary groups who are willing to use physical violence to defend the union with the United Kingdom. Now, in most cases, in this side of the divide, Protestant Unionist Loyalist, and sometimes it's called PUL, if one is Protestant, in most cases, one is Unionist. If one is Unionist, you might tend to disavow loyalism because of its tendency toward violence, but Loyalists absolutely would see themselves as uncompromising Unionist. The other side of the divide would be Catholics, who made up in the 2011 census 45.14%. The political manifestation on this side of the divide is nationalism. Nationalists are people who support a united Ireland and oppose British presence or the British occupation of what they would refer to as the North of Ireland. Many of my conversations with nationalists and with Republicans started with me making the mistake of asking about their views on contemporary Northern Ireland. And then it would be a 30-minute lecture on why it wasn't Northern Ireland, that they didn't accept that title for the state. They lived in the north of Ireland because they did not view the state as legitimate. The paramilitary groups who would use physical violence to break the union are typically referred to as Republicans. So the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was that armed, more violent form of Irish nationalism. Again, most Catholics would be nationalist. Nationalists would tend to have more sympathy for Republican groups as well. It's not to say that you cannot find a Protestant nationalist or a Catholic unionist. You certainly can, but by and large, these are the divisions we see at play in contemporary Northern Ireland. Understanding how those divisions came to be is a long journey. It's an 800, 900-year journey that we simply don't have time to spend on here. The author Devlin Murphy has called Northern Ireland a place apart. And I think that's a good descriptor, as a place apart, because here you see the relationship between England, Great Britain, and the island of Ireland. In 1169 was the first time that we saw a full-scale invasion, attempted colonization on the part of English settlers coming to Ireland. That ramped up quite a bit in 1610 with London deciding that they need to more intentionally plant English and Scottish Protestants in the north of Ireland, this region here called Ulster. And the plantation of Ulster was meant to allow Protestantism to survive and thrive in a country that was largely Catholic. The Protestant Reformation had, for all practical purposes, bypassed Ireland. The plantation of Ulster was meant to give London a foothold in the northernmost section of the island of Ireland and to also establish a base of Protestantism that would be loyal to the British crown. So we have these tensions now between Protestant and Catholic, between Unionist and Nationalist, between Loyalist and Republican. And over the course of the centuries, that eventually leads to the birth of Northern Ireland in 1921, separate from the Republic of Ireland. And you see here that the constituent territories of the United Kingdom are England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. From its birth as a country, you could argue that Northern Ireland was born in violence, and certainly from its birth, it has had sporadic outbreaks of violence, but the most sustained period of conflict occurred between 1968 to 1998 in a period of time we call the Troubles. Over the course of that time in Northern Ireland, which is a country, a province about the size of Connecticut, with about half the population, there was a death toll of 3,532 people, with another 42,216 injured. Proportionally, if you took that death toll and applied it to the US, that death toll in the US proportionally would have been about 500,000 people. That's more dead than we lost in World War II. It's 10 times the number of dead in Vietnam. The violence in the Troubles in Northern Ireland was indiscriminate. It was random. It could happen in a bar, a pub, in a shopping center, on a bus. So in many ways, everyone in Northern Ireland lived with the specter of violence hanging over their heads for 30 years. So even though the actual number may not be something we look at and see as 3,532 as striking, the reality is that everyone in Northern Ireland lived in fear that they could be the next victim, the next person of collateral damage in this violence. The violence ended, or at least transformed to some degree, with the Good Friday Peace Agreement, signed April 10th, 1998. Again, Senator Mitchell from Maine was one of the architects of that particular peace agreement. Since 1998, it is not that violence has been unheard of. There certainly have been sporadic attacks here and there since 1998. Actually the worst casualty episode of violence would occur after 1998 in the bombing in Omagh, but the sustained violence between loyalists and Republican paramilitaries was pretty much put on hold since that time. And it's really been transformed now into more of a war of culture, a war of politics, a war of identity, rather than a war of physical weapons. So the three things I look at when I'm trying to determine to what degree do we have concern about contemporary Northern Ireland have to do with memory, with governance, and social fragmentation. And let me look with you briefly at those. Cultures of memory are littered throughout Northern Ireland. I say in the book that Northern Ireland produces a lot of memory, and it consumes a lot of memory, more so than most any society or post-conflict society in which I've ever worked. One of the interviewees said that to drive through Northern Ireland, the past screams at you from every gabled wall. And what you see here are two gable walls with well-known murals, one of Bobby Sands in West Belfast, the other the Prince of Orange in Sandy Row, a loyalist section of Belfast. And these murals, and the murals in Northern Ireland number at any given time between 300 and 400 different murals across the country. These murals become points of community education, points of community identity, and most importantly, points of memory. Another person I interviewed in Northern Ireland said the problem with the past here is the past is never where we thought we left it. In other words, the past is always intruding on the present. And our children grow up with the past always in front of them, with the past always screaming at them from the end of every gable wall. We could spend a whole lecture looking at these murals, but just to give you a sense of what some of these are look like, here you see a loyalist neighborhood in the shadow of Harlan and Wolff, the ship builder that built the Titanic in Belfast. Those two huge cranes are called Samson and Goliath. But here you see that the murals very often are about history and about identity. And it's how history and identity is taught. It's how it's fostered. It's how it's cultured. It's how it's understood in these communities. And you see in this mural, the Ulster conflict is about nationality. This we shall maintain. Scotland, Wales, England, and Ulster form the United Kingdom. And very clearly here, you see it's not a reference to religion. It's a reference to identity. That to be in Ulster, to be in Northern Ireland, is to be British. You are part of the United Kingdom. The Queen is our Queen. The currency is our currency. The national football team of England is our team. These are the things that are about nationality. This is the crux of the identity issue. But the murals are also, in addition to being about history and identity, they're also about violence. They're also about the perpetuation of violence. They're also about the threat of violence. This is a well-known mural in a loyalist housing estate, which is a housing community that has an unemployment rate of about 80% in North Belfast. And you see the mural says, "Prepared for peace." And these are loyalist paramilitary figures, but ready for war. And that uneasy tension in the book, I describe it as the low, steady hum of tension that you feel when you're in Northern Ireland, and particularly in Belfast. Prepared for peace, ready to accept peace, but also ready for war when things go sideways, ready for war when things like our identity, our history, our heritage are threatened. Here you see from the Republican, nationalist Republican side, this is a mural in West Belfast, in the Falls Road section of West Belfast. And here you see the story of the history. Here from the 1916 Rising, here you see the presence of women within the Irish Republican Army, the Irish Republican Volunteers, the uprising. These are the blanket men on protests in prison, refusing to wear their prison garb because they demanded to be seen as political prisoners rather than ordinary common prisoners. Republicanism also has its own forms of violent murals. This is one from Derry in Northern Ireland. Here you see this mural. This is put up by a dissident Republican group, Unfinished Revolution. That's still the revolution started in 1916 to get the Brits out of Ireland is still not finished. And this group is intent on finishing it. At the top of this mural, you see the PSNI badge with a cross mark through it. This is the police service of Northern Ireland. Many in the Republican movement who are still committed to violence, to end what they see as British occupation, see the police service of Northern Ireland as colluding and collaborating with British security forces in this continuing oppression. And when you think of these murals and you think of the impact of growing up in a country where whether you walk to the shop, whether you're walking to school, whether you're walking to church, you're walking by these images, you recognize that here is a transmission of a form of cultural trauma. And in transmitting that trauma, it's going to leave its fingerprints on the individual people who are caught in this legacy of trauma. And we see these individual legacies of cultural trauma throughout Northern Ireland. Since 1998, since the peace agreement, the suicide rate has doubled compared to international suicide rates. Northern Ireland is in the top quarter. It's estimated that over 34,000 people in Northern Ireland suffer from PTSD. That's the highest level of any post-conflict country that we know of. So think of any post-conflict country in the Middle East, in Africa, and Eastern Europe, and Latin America, and North America. We don't see that type of level of PTSD from what people have suffered. And again, this is a 30-year conflict where there were no sidelines. Anyone had the potential to be a victim. Has the highest prescription rates in the UK. One of the world's highest prescription rates for antidepressants is in Northern Ireland. And it has had, over the past several years, increasing levels of domestic spousal violence that we've seen as well. So what I conclude when I look at these issues of memory is that Northern Ireland is a country with a contested biography. They've shared a past, but there's no shared narrative of that past. There's no shared memory of that past. There's a common history, but not a common memory. So in its place are multiple contested, conflicting, and competing memories. And each one of those is like an electrified wire. The surest way to get into an argument in Northern Ireland is to start talking about memory and history. Now you have a war, not a war of weapons as much, but a war of historical narratives, individual narratives, collective narratives, and institutional narratives that really have threatened a lot of the fabric of this society. The second piece I look at after memory has to do with governance. How does governance work in a post-conflict society, or how does governance work in a deeply divided society? In Northern Ireland, governance is done. These are called devolved institutions. It's a territory in the part of the United Kingdom, but the Northern Ireland Assembly that you see here, called Stormont, has responsibility for most of the day-to-day operations in Northern Ireland. Since Stormont was put in place and given these devolved powers after the Good Friday Agreement, you see how many times it's been suspended, beginning in 2000, continuing on through 2020. The suspension simply means that the government of Northern Ireland is no longer functioning in terms of day-to-day matters, that either Westminster from London has stepped in and taken over direct control, or there's just a skeleton civil servant crew that is trying to govern in the most bare bones way it can govern. Since the assembly was put in place, it's been something like 7,000 days where it could have been functioning, but close to 3,300 of those days, it has not been functioning. It's not been open. It's not been in place. So almost half of its existence, the government has not been operational. The most recent suspension of the assembly occurred on January 9th, 2017. So again, just as I was arriving in Belfast to begin my research, and did not end until January 11th, 2020. That's the longest peacetime period a government has ever had without a setting government, without functioning. We've never had a government during peacetime go as long with its doors shut as Northern Ireland did from 2017 to 2020. So you can get a sense that we have a lot of concerns about the dysfunctionality of governance in Northern Ireland. But even when it's functioning, one of the things that concern me in terms of risk, and for US listeners, you'll recognize this in our country as well, is that even when it's functioning, the degree of polarization was remarkable, political polarization over the course of time. Here you see the 6 National Assembly elections, the next one scheduled for no later than May 2022. And what you'll see here is that Sinn Féin is the darker green. They're the extreme nationalist political party. The dark red is the DUP. They're the extreme unionist political party. You see, in 1997, the DUP and Sinn Féin, relatively small constituents throughout Northern Ireland. The other political parties in 1997 were decidedly much more moderate. But look what has happened to moderation and what has happened to the extreme political parties through 2001, 2005, 2010, 2015, and again in 2017. What we see is the rise of political polarization and the death of moderate political voices. So even though Northern Ireland has a multi-party system, democratic system, the two dominant political voices have remained, and still today, the two extreme voices, Sinn Féin and the DUP. There's some possibility and hope that would change in the next election. One of the things the Good Friday Agreement did was to say to bring people into governance, what we need to do is take the largest nationalist party and the largest unionist party and basically give them the ability to share the power in governance. And here you see the two setting ministers. Arlene Foster to the right is the first minister of Northern Ireland. She is from the DUP. Michelle O'Neill to the left is the deputy first minister from Sinn Féin. Their titles are different, but they share power equally, and much of this power sharing works its way out throughout the Northern Ireland government. Unfortunately, though, I think one of the concerns we've seen comparatively about power sharing, and we've seen this in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, is what power sharing tends to do is it institutionalizes, it entrenches, it puts in concrete the identities it's meant to reconcile. And when we think back to the previous slide I showed you with the growth of the DUP and the growth of Sinn Féin and the polarization of politics in Northern Ireland, I think you could argue that much of that comes from the way we settled the peace, the way we set up government, the way we set up these structures. And as Adrian Guelke, who's at Queen's University, says, there's a lot of ways we can think about stability, peace, good governance, fairness, and democracy in a deeply divided society. Power sharing is only one of those ways. And I think there are many people now who look back at this particular piece of the Good Friday Agreement with some mixed feelings because it seems to have set in concrete the identities of nationalist and unionist, rather than try to reconcile and break those identities down. So as I look at politics in Northern Ireland, I say it's existential, which means that it is a part of people's everyday life and existence. And it is unfortunately representative of a deeply divided reality. The Good Friday Agreement, and I think it was a monumental achievement by Senator Mitchell for sure, and the people who brought it about. And it had wonderfully noble intentions. But one of the things I argue in the book is that there are parts of the Good Friday Agreement that have taken those deep divisions it meant to reconcile, and rather than reconciling them, it's sewn them into the very fabric of governance and sewn them into the very fabric of existence in terms of civil life in Northern Ireland. So rather than being expanded and reconciled, I think it's become more entrenched and more reified in that degree. And the final risk issue I look at has to do with social fragmentation. And the title of this chapter is The Walls Entered into Our Souls. And I take that from a walk I took with a former loyalist paramilitary prisoner along a section of walls in Belfast, similar to what you see on this image. And he said, you know, they always told us the walls were here for our protection. But he was very reflective and he said, in truth, these walls have entered into our souls. They've hardened us. The walls have fragmented us physically in ways that have just, you know, expounded the already ideological differences and fragmentation we have as well. Some people will say that the first peace wall built in Northern Ireland was actually built in 1866, before Northern Ireland was born, was built in Belfast in 1866 when the Belfast city cemetery planners decided to build a wall 9 feet deep in the ground to separate Protestant graves from Catholic graves. Today in Northern Ireland, there are 116 separate walls across the face of Northern Ireland, many of them, as you see here, very tall. This is a wall. It's the only wall that runs through a public park in all of Europe. This is a wall in Alexandra Park, Belfast. You'll see graffiti on both sides of the wall. You'll see gates shut in the wall. Sometimes gates can be open. Most of the times gates are kept closed because these are what are called interface areas. They're areas where Catholics or nationalists live very close to Protestants and Unionists. And part of trying to calm the violence has been to literally just put a wall separating the two communities from each other. Here you see the wall in Alexandra Park is opened. These walls are all throughout Belfast. The gates are opened, typically from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on a weekday. They tend to be closed at night. They tend to be closed on weekends. They tend to be closed around contentious times where violence might flare up. So to be a taxi driver in Belfast is to learn how to navigate your way around a city that is going to be closed by gates and walls at various points. In my research in terms of social fragmentation, I also ran across a contest the Belfast Telegraph did in 1970, where it asked children to write about the kind of ulster I want. And I ran across this letter, one of the winning letters from Jeffrey Nelson, a young boy who said, "I'd like to see an Ulster where there were no riots. I'd like to see an Ulster where all people live together in peace without fighting." But notice these next sentences from 51 years ago. Jeffrey says, "I would like to see all children, no matter what religion, going to the same school. This way they could grow up together and understand each other, understand that there's no difference between them, the children become friends, and when they left school would continue their friendship. I hope I don't have too long to wait for the Ulster I would like to see." The unfortunate reality is the Ulster he would like to see in terms of education is not there today. Integrated schooling, where Protestant and Catholic school children go together, makes up about 7% of children who go to school in Northern Ireland. Only 7% go to integrated schooling. 93% go to single identity schooling. Protestant children go to Protestant schools, Catholic children go to Catholic schools. So what he hoped to see 50 years ago is no close to reality today. I saw these parallel educational systems, the parallel social systems in Northern Ireland. I saw this when I would teach and visit courses at Queen's University in Belfast. I'd ask students, when was the first time you met someone from the other side? If you're Protestant, when did you first meet Catholic? If you're Catholic, when did you first meet Protestant? And inevitably, whatever class I was speaking, about 95% of the students would say, the first time I met someone from the other side was when I came to Queen's University. They spent their first 18, 19 years of life in complete social segregation, complete religious segregation, and completely segregated educational facilities as well. My concern about this type of social fragmentation is that this is an isolated space. And in these isolated spaces where you don't have a chance to interact with the other from someone on the other side of the divide, suspicion grows, mistrust, stereotypes, fear, stigmas, misunderstandings, fear mongering. There's nothing to check them because you don't have those exchanges that would allow you to check those. Echo chambers are created where difficult conversations are unspoken, assumptions are unchallenged, and herd mentalities go unchecked. And our concern about all this risk related to contested memory, dysfunctional governance, and social fragmentation is that leaves the potential for violent conflict. And that in a deeply divided society, it's a fault line. Maybe the violence is not always there, but it's a fault line. And when that fault line shifts, the violence is going to come back in the way that race is a fault line in the US. Sometimes it's not as apparent in terms of violence and demonstrations, but when police brutality happens, when racially motivated crimes and killings happen, we see that fault line exposed. And that's our concern. And it was my concern as I wrote about risk in Northern Ireland. When I think about the things that could trigger that fault line, that could accelerate and escalate some of the tensions, unfortunately, there's a whole menu of things we would have to be concerned about for contemporary Northern Ireland. It could be acute economic deterioration, and we're seeing that because of the effects of COVID. It's having some devastating economic effects on Northern Ireland. Outbreaks of limited paramilitary violence. Very often now, paramilitaries really are working as criminal gangs, and we're seeing some increasing outbreaks of violence. If there's a vote for United Ireland, that can only happen every 7 years, and it has to be called by the British Secretary of State. But if there is one, and it's held in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that's going to be a flashpoint for hostilities. Brexit, questions of constitutional identity, that recognition I had in Venice in 2016 that Brexit was going to have some implications is significant. If there's a referendum on Scottish independence, I mean, if the United Kingdom starts to break up, it's going to affect Northern Ireland. This is the 100th year of Northern Ireland's birth. That's a flashpoint for us. The release of census results in 2021, where it's expected that there'll be a Catholic majority. That's going to be a time of tension. In the 2022 Assembly elections, if Sinn Féin wins more seats in DUP, those can present times of tensions as well. But with all that said that I've written about in the book, what has happened since I wrote the book is obviously the eruption of violence now. So why now? Why are we seeing the buses on fire? Why are we seeing the peace lines attacked on both sides by loyalist groups predominantly, but also nationalist groups, Republican groups as well? I think there are three things we can point to, and I'll wrap up with this. One is that what Brexit necessitated, because it pulled Northern Ireland and the UK out of the EU, but kept the Republic of Ireland in the EU, is Brexit was going to necessitate a border of some type. No one wanted to put the border on the land between the Republic and Northern Ireland because that would have just invited violence. Boris Johnson, despite saying he would never do it, put the border in the Irish Sea. So it has made it more difficult to import goods from Britain into Northern Ireland, and it's made it easier for Northern Ireland to exchange goods with the Republic of Ireland. For loyalists, this has been a betrayal of the highest order, because what they see is an economic united Ireland, and they see a path to a united Ireland, and they feel completely betrayed by Brexit and by Boris Johnson. We also see this just a couple of weeks ago, that the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland decided there would be no prosecutions for a funeral from last June for a former IRA man by the name of Bobby Story. Big Bobby is how he's referred to in the Republican community. I never had a chance to meet or interview him. I spoke to many people who knew him very well. When he died in June, about 2,000 mourners, you see here, turned out in Belfast at the height of COVID restrictions. There are supposed to be no more than 30 people at a funeral. Here you see no mask. You see a couple of thousand people. Immediately, unionists said, Sinn Féin, nationalists have to be held responsible for violating these breaches. And it was only on March 30th that the Public Prosecuting Service said there are going to be no prosecution. So again, if you're unionist, if you're loyalist, you feel like this is unfair. We couldn't have held a mourning like this, but they get away with it. And then finally, for unionists and loyalists, They have a sense that their identity is under existential threat. They may lose what it means to be British. If there's a unified Ireland, where does a unionist have a home? Where does a loyalist have a home? And large part of the reason we're seeing the outbreak of armed violence now is a recognition that the only thing we have left to do to prevent the erosion of our identity is the commission of armed violence. I do think, and if you're interested more in these current events, I've written a piece that was published last week in the Washington Post, an op-ed piece, and also a piece published early last week in the Conversation, and you should be able to find either of those online. I do think there's some hope going forward. We can always promote a healthy memory environment by constructively dealing with the past. Dealing with the past is a constant business in Northern Ireland. I think it can be done better. It can be done in a healthier way. I do think political moderation, generosity, trust, and respect can come back. And there's some possibility that politically moderate parties are starting to take on some of the votes that the DUP and Sinn Féin may be leaking. So maybe political moderation comes back and has a voice. And there's also the possibility that maybe what divided societies can begin to heal from is to begin the process of healing, is to say, instead of thinking about ourselves in these subordinate identities, can we think about ourselves as something bigger? Instead of unionist nationalists, can we think of ourselves as Northern Irish? Maybe that's what unites us. And we see in some of the polls in Northern Ireland a tendency to start to move that direction. So there's space for resilience, there's space for hope, but Brexit is contracting that space, and the impact of Brexit is contracting that space. I'll close the way I close the book, which is a conversation, very brief conversation I had with Martin Mcginnis just a couple of months before his death. Martin Mcginnis is a former IRA commander, served time in prison, began to turn his attentions to peace. Here you see his handshake, famous handshake with the Queen. He was one of the people that tried to bring back Stormont. He also resigned from Stormont, which led to its closure in 2017. But when I met Mcginnis in January 2017, we had a brief chat about the work I was doing, and he grabbed my hand very warmly as I was leaving the conversation. And he simply said, "I hope it wasn't all a waste." And I think that that was really what animated and drove my work in the book, is to say, I hope, we hope all the good work done in trying to build peace in Northern Ireland wasn't a waste. As a matter of fact, I dedicated the book. The dedication of the book reads, "With deep appreciation for the people, cultures, history, land, and place of Northern Ireland, and even deeper hope for its future." And I do have that deeper hope for its future. So I know we have time here, about 10, 12 minutes or so, for some questions. So I will turn it back to my colleague, Ashley, to help moderate that. But thank you very much for taking the time to be with me for this.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for that glimpse into the book. And it's obviously an important book, a very timely book. And there are already several questions about current policies. And I also want to invite those of you who are with us to send in your questions and submit them to the Q&A. The first several questions are about education. And our first question wants to know, what are your views on the current shared education policies, and do you feel as though they offer any hope for the future?
Oh, thank you. You know, I mentioned in the presentation that integrated education only accounts for about 7% of children in Northern Ireland schools, and they keep trying to push integrated education. Liam Neeson has a new advertisement trying to push schools to decide to become integrated. But it's really a step too far for many people, because you're pulling children out of residential settings that are predominantly Protestant or Catholic, trying to push them into integrated schools. So it's been a hard push for in Northern Ireland. What has replaced it, and I think has started to win the day, is a concept called shared education, which says in integrated education, Protestant Catholic students come together in the same school, they're in the same school every day, day after day after day, and so on. And again, it's just not drawing up, not signing up a lot of people. Shared education says Protestant Catholic schools still maintain their separate identity, but we find ways to bring them together. We share curriculum. We share some forms of instruction. Maybe we share athletic teams. They're not together every day, all day, but maybe they come together enough to start to break down some of the boundaries. People who favor integrated education say shared education is just a shortcut that's never going to work. People who advocate for shared education say no one's signing up for integrated education. Shared education should be what we can offer and what we can do well. I think at the end of the day, though, Ashley, I'm always hesitant to put all of the weight of fixing a problem on education. Because even if shared education works well, children are still going back to their segregated neighborhoods, their own churches, their own playgrounds, their own athletic facilities, their own stores they frequent. I mean, there's a lot of other shared aspects of society that also need to start breaking down if education is going to do the work as well.
Well, speaking of those alternative spheres of society, this next question comes from Jan Cohen, and the question is, do the respective clergy of Northern Ireland ever come together? And do you think that this could be a collaboration that might make a difference?
Um, the clergy issue is an interesting one because, again, most people think Protestant Catholic, it's a religious issue. It really is an issue of national identity. Early on in my research, I spent time with clergy and faith organizations to get a sense of their impact on the ground. And I think Northern Ireland is experiencing what much of the Western world is experiencing in terms of Christianity, which is a grain of its pews. And when I would go to a church, whether it was Protestant or Catholic, relatively seldom do you see young people, relatively seldom do you see middle-aged people. It's older people. The churches on both sides are dying a little bit in the same way that many religious institutions in the US are struggling to find relevance, to find connection. And I think early on, and I even had people within clergy say this, that we're just not seen as relevant in Northern Irish society. People don't turn to us if they're thinking of reconciliation, if they're thinking of healing. The church just doesn't have the relevance that it once had. So there have been some remarkable clergy in Northern Ireland that I've gotten to know over the years who did great work leading up to the Good Friday Peace Agreement and in the years since then. But that space where people turn to religious leaders to help deal with the problems of a deeply divided society, it's a pretty small space now in Northern Ireland. And again, to even hear that from religious leaders who recognize we just don't have the voice that we used to have, we just don't have the relevance we used to have, was pretty insightful.
Wonderful. Thank you. This next question, and I want you to know, Jim, I'm omitting many, many words of great affirmation and of congratulations to you that are coming in with all of these questions. So I think that's important to share. But this question is about downstream prevention and transitional justice. Do you feel that given the very precarious situation in Northern Ireland, are there any current efforts around downstream prevention and transitional justice that offer particular hope? And in particular, is there a place for memorialization in this work around potential shared memorials or shared culture?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a place. There will likely not in my lifetime be a museum of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It just is too. The narratives are too competing, the narratives are too conflicting. When I was there in 2017, I actually think there was a radio show one morning, the Stephen Nolan show that everyone listens to. And this question came up about, could we build a museum of the Troubles? And it was a angry, I mean, it was a fascinating thing to listen to, because the only thing people could agree on would be absolutely not. There's never going to be a shared story of it. So I don't know if memorialization and memory in that way is necessarily the way forward. I do think, though, in terms of transitional justice, there are some important things finally starting to happen. For instance, finally, it looks like victims of the Troubles and their family members who've had to care for them because of their injuries may actually qualify for pensions, for financial reparations from the government. Now, the fact that this is still hasn't happened till this day is amazing. But there are some very committed people in Northern Ireland in the victim sector who are committed to trying to make right and do right for the people who are still suffering from what they experienced during the Troubles. I think that scheme, if it can be funded and if we can agree on who funds it and we can start taking applications, that will go a long way toward making people feel like there is some form of justice of some type. So those type of movements are taking place, to be sure.
Right. Well, this next question is about connections between Northern Ireland and the US. And for those who don't know, of course, Jim, you've written quite a bit about risk in the US context and warning signs. This question comes from Michael Wakefield, who says, I recall a great deal of identification with and support for the extreme Republican side among my own third or fourth generation Irish American relatives and friends in Boston area in the 1970s. So he's wondering, to what extent has the divisions in Northern Ireland been affected, if at all, by the influence of populations of Irish heritage in the United States?
That's a great question. The Irish diaspora has played a huge role during the Troubles, and also obviously in the Good Friday Peace Agreement as well. It's difficult to go into a pub in many sections of Belfast and not see photos of George Mitchell and Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton is the chancellor at Queen's University Belfast now, the honorary chancellor. So the American role has been a significant one. I spoke to someone in Belfast who told me of going to Boston to visit relatives. He was Catholic, walking into a bar, and automatically at the door of the bar, he spreads his leg, spreads his arm, because in Belfast, if you walk into a bar in the 80s, you were going to be searched. And he automatically did it at the door of this bar in Boston. And the bartender said, "You must be from Belfast." And he said, "Yeah, yeah, I was." And it's just a natural reflex. But he was amazed as he went into the bar that there was a jar at the front that simply said, "For the boys." And it was a jar for money to be collected, to be sent back to the IRA for whatever purposes they deemed suitable for use of the money, which often involved the purchase of weaponry. So absolutely, there has been a strong connection between Irish Americans and the Troubles, particularly on the Catholic nationalist side. Friends of Sinn Féin are still very, very active in the US, very strongly pushing for Irish unification. And where you're seeing it today is President Biden is seen as the most Irish American president since President Kennedy. So there is great hope among the nationalist community that President Biden is going to be a force for reunification of the Republic of Ireland with the north of Ireland. So yeah, it's impossible to understand the dynamics of the Troubles and the peace process and contemporary Northern Ireland without recognizing the role that Irish Americans have played as well.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and there are many more questions than we'll have time for, but I'll just end with this one and then offer you, Jim, a chance if you'd like to say anything before people sign off. And this final question is from Kirsty Sandy, and it says, "Thank you for the outstanding talk, Jim. This is your fourth book, and I actually believe it might be your sixth book, Jim. It says your work has heavily influenced what we know about how and why genocide happens and how we take steps to prevent it. In this book launch, I'd love to know something that you've discovered since publishing your first book that surprised you, that you didn't expect, or that you've changed your perspective on.
Oh, thanks, Kirsty. I would say the thing I found most challenging about this work in this book, and I loved this work. I mean, I love Northern Ireland. I love the people there. I love my time there. Something about Northern Ireland resonates very deeply with me as a child of the South. I grew up in a deeply divided society. I live now in a deeply divided society. So Northern Ireland feels eerily at home and familiar to me in many ways. But I think if there's something that caught me by surprise is I went into this book project, this research, believing there was such a thing as a post-conflict society. I really went into it thinking you can have a society after conflict that becomes post-conflict, that there's a line drawn and the society becomes something different. I think the awakening piece for me of this research has been to say, I don't know if there's any such thing as a post-conflict society. That when you've been through conflict, 30 years of protracted conflict in Northern Ireland, I don't know if there's a post-peace to it. The conflict is over. And maybe you become post-peace agreement or become post-violence. But the conflict, and I think I'd say this is true of the US, the conflicts we've been through as a country, they still stay woven into the fabric of who we are in ways that I find myself no longer using the phrase post-conflict because I really don't know if that exists. I don't know if it can really be true in the sense of it. So I think that's been my biggest just self-insight from working on this one. So thank you for the question. Thank you, Ashley, for your work in organizing and moderating this. Thank you all. I've been looking to see names of friends and family on the side here of people who've shown up. And it's so meaningful that I get to celebrate this with all of you and that you've taken the time to celebrate here with me as well. So thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a good day.